We can't be sure what was going through Bob Mybush's mind as he prepared for the meeting on March 24, 1919. It was an important meeting, perhaps the most important meeting ever for the Toowoomba Rugby League. Members met at the long-forgotten Gordon Club on the corner of Margaret and Duggan Streets. They would decide what rugby code would be played in a post-World War I Toowoomba, League or Union. The Darling Downs Gazette outlined both cases. Union was the traditional sport, while rugby league was now seen as a more attractive and more popular game in Queensland. One writer for the Gazette, known as Century, wrote disparagingly about rugby league's stigma of professionalism. This has been a common argument against rugby league since its beginnings, the idea of rugby union's purity and amateurism against rugby league's pursuit of wealth. In any case, it's unlikely many Toowoomba players earned more than a few pounds playing football at this time.
Another argument posited around Australia at the time and in the north of England was that the boys who had been sent to the trenches by the upper class in England and in Australia didn't feel that they could come back to play in the sport run by the very people who put them in the trenches in the first place.
As a former Queensland Rugby Union representative, it's certainly possible that these competing arguments were on Mybush's mind, but it was clear which sport had his heart in 1919. It's fairly conjecture, but perhaps not outrageous to consider, that Mr. Mybush was thinking back to 1913, when the first rugby league competition was played in Toowoomba. This season was a success, combined with rep games against Brisbane and Ipswich. It was followed in 1914 with an equally ambitious competition that was marred only by disputes with the Toowoomba Rugby Union over playing grounds. Now in 1914, Mybush could be forgiven for thinking that the TRL was primed for great success. But no one could have predicted the events that were to happen in 1914 to 1918. While in most parts of Australia, World War I stopped rugby union competitions, rugby league carried on.
When World War I came along, rugby league and rugby union took very different views about where they should play. Rugby union took a more traditional view and said that they didn't feel they could continue to play while people were fighting overseas. Rugby league took the view that it would be better to keep playing, give the people at home something to do, some entertainment to take their mind off the war.
Things are sometimes different on the Darling Downs, and in Toowoomba it was league that stopped, while union maintained a presence. The early success of the Toowoomba Rugby League was almost all for nothing, as the game was effectively wiped from the sporting landscape for 4 years. A few Toowoomba men sought rugby league games in Brisbane or played in charity matches supporting the war effort.
Rugby union went into a bit of a recess. The impact of that was after 4 years, when the war had finished and things were starting to come back to normal. Rugby league had pretty well established itself, not only in the metropolitan areas, but pretty well across the country areas of New South Wales and Queensland, and they took up a position that they've never really relinquished in the 100 or so years since then.
Code wars of the previous few years were unlikely to be on top of anyone's mind. But by 1919, with the war over and the country attempting to return to normal, the interested citizens of Toowoomba had a choice to make.
Yes, the Mybush family were very prominent in rugby league and rugby union. Prominent amongst those in terms of rugby league in Toowoomba was Bob Mybush. Bob was a halfback, played rugby union for Queensland before the war. After the war, actually played rugby league for Queensland, so he was a dual interstate player. But more importantly for him was the fact that he became a very strong advocate of rugby league. Now his brother Lou, who went on to play in the famous teams of 1924 and 1925, was a journalist, and he wrote lots of the facts and stories that we hear today were written by Lou Mybush.
And while we can never know for sure what was going on inside Bob Mybush's mind that evening, thanks to the comprehensive transcript reported by the Chronicle, we do know what he said.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to address this fine group of rugby enthusiasts. As many of you are aware, my family are steeped in rugby and for the most part have played the Union Code. Quite proudly, my father William was called the father of rugby union by the Darling Downs Gazette in 1912. My two brothers Jack and Lou represented our country at the Union game, and I was fortunate to wear the colours of Queensland. Tonight, I believe that it is time to get the feeling of this meeting as to whether we are keen to form up the rugby union, or as I would advocate, shift our allegiance to the new code of league. Practically every town in Queensland has adopted the league. Efforts are being made to resuscitate the old rugby union, but I feel that as soon as they begin to tamper with the game, the union will forfeit all claims as union. I've heard of proposed innovations regarding the union game, including eliminating the line-out and reducing the player number. These actions would be an admission of the up-to-datedness of the league game. There is no question at all as to the comparative attractiveness of the two games. This was shown on a visit to Sydney some years ago when an interstate union game attracted 6,000 people, while at a ground close by, 20,000 persons were present to watch an interclub league fixture. Prejudice in Queensland has been the greatest hindrance to the progress of the game. The professional element has to be dealt with, for this has a direct bearing on the great public schools, and this is the chief objection of these schools to the league game. Take it from me, as far as I'm aware, no player has ever received a penny for his services to the league. The time has arrived when Toowoomba must decide which course it is to adopt, whether it will play the old rugby union game or the up-to-date league football. As one who has played both codes, I am convinced that the league game is better. I would therefore move that the rugby union, as constituted, be disbanded.
But Mybush had an opponent. In an equally passionate speech, Toowoomba Grammar headmaster George Barber advocated that the competition remain under union rules.
Mr. Barber was the headmaster of the Toowoomba Grammar School for about 30 years. He'd come from Sydney where he'd been a prominent sportsman. He'd actually represented New South Wales in rugby union. He played cricket to a high level, and he was actually at one stage the chairman of the Australian Cricket Board of Control before he came to Toowoomba, so very prominent in sport. Particularly to note about him in the arguments and the debate about rugby league, rugby union was he was a very, very firm advocate of rugby union, believer in the ideal of amateurism and very much against what he himself termed the taint of professionalism. He believed that playing a sport for money was not a gentlemanly thing to do, and he was in line with a lot of the public schools, not only in Australia, but the public schools in England, who believed in this strict amateurism.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mybush, for the frank manner in which you have placed the matter before this meeting. Naturally, I am opposed to anything that interferes with the good old game of rugby. Personally, I believe that if the two games were played side by side, there would be little to choose between them. I admit that as a spectacular game, the league game is slightly superior. I think that the union game, with one or two alterations, could be made as attractive, if not more, than league. On behalf of my school, I must say that it is impossible for the school to join league until the whole of the schools of Queensland see eye to eye with Mr. Mybush and are willing to take up the league game. I am very much afraid that from my experience of the league game in New South Wales, that it will be difficult to keep the league game in Queensland free from the taint of professionalism. When the game started in New South Wales, it was an amateur body, but I am informed that there was always a certain amount of money dispersed that did not appear on the balance sheet. I am not in a position to say whether the league authorities in Queensland were guilty of the same thing or not, but I have heard it said that the balance sheets did not show the expenditure of every penny. That may be wrong. We must, as a public school, take the university as our model. The varsity has this year, and I believe will for many years, decide to play the union game. Toowoomba Grammar is bound, as an amateur school, and in the interests of clean sport, to give all our support to further the interests of the good old game of rugby union football.
It was put to a vote. Would the union follow the rest of Queensland and Australia and take up the more exciting rugby league? Or would they be persuaded by the virtues of amateurism and go it alone with the union? In the end, Barber's arguments held little sway. When the votes were tallied, Toowoomba had chosen Rugby League 49-12. Some in the media took the decision quite hard. The Darling Downs Gazette carried a mock obituary for the old TRU.
There passed away at the Gordon Club on Tuesday night, at about 9 p.m, an old resident of this city, in the person of the Toowoomba Rugby Union. Though healthy and vigorous in earlier days, the deceased as so overcome by the stress and worry of war that the passing was not unexpected. Many of the Union's friends were present at the time, though adversity, that great tester of sincere friendships, found that many had grown cold and not in the least perturbed by the sadness of it all.
This strange column ends by naming Bob Mybush among the TRU's funeral arrangers. And we can't know if Bob thought that was funny. He was probably too busy to care. After all, he had a brand new competition to worry about. The Toowoomba Rugby League.